This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, cultural workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Shanice Robinson-Blacknell, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at San Francisco State University. Shanice's research and teaching revolve around pedagogy, activism, and the relationship between academic work and community intervention and collaboration. In this conversation, we discuss the meaning of education and pedagogy in Black Studies classrooms, the meaning of community for the past and future of the field, and the distinctiveness of Black ways of making and deploying critical knowledge. Good afternoon, Shanice. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. It's the end of my Wednesday. We were talking beforehand. Wednesday is the day I don't teach, but it seems like it's also the day everybody schedules all the unpleasant obligations of the day. Those obligations are over, and here we are recording this podcast, which I'm really happy about. I'm so thankful that you made the time for a number of reasons. First of all, I just think your perspective on the podcast is going to be really interesting and important. So thanks in advance for your thoughtfulness. Also, you're talking from San Francisco State, which is the origins of Black studies. And so I just always want to acknowledge that Bay Area people generally, but especially San Francisco State, it's such an historic department to be talking from. And so just want to underscore that as a way of saying welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. And I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Likewise.
So we'll have a chance to talk about some of your research and writing and teaching and how you imagine the field of Black studies and what it means to you in a moment. But we always start out the podcast, and so I wanted to ask you this first question, which is what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
Yeah, I think what drew me is I grew up in California, so I'm a Richmond Bay Area native. And in California, the curriculum, K-12 curriculum, is controlled by Common Core. And so depending on your ethnicity, there's almost like a complete erasure of one's history. Originally, when I got to SF State, I was like, I'm going to be the next Halle Berry. So I wanted to be like a theater major. Realized I'm bad at that. And then I was like, okay, I'll follow in
Acting is a real skill.
Oh, it's a real skill. When we were like doing the exercises, I was like, I'm actually really bad at this. So I probably should pivot and choose something more practical. And then I tried criminal justice because I wanted to follow in my dad's footsteps in working in law enforcement. I realized I don't really see myself being like in law, not from like, the perspective of which he wanted me to go into law. So then I was like, okay, what do I do now? And so I took my first Africana Studies class, and it was the introduction to Black psychology. And that expanded my mind. I realized I was getting better grades when I was taking classes that was in Africana Studies versus taking like traditional psychology or traditional sociology or history. I noticed I wasn't really thriving because there was a complete disconnection from the course content. And so from there, I was like, I think that this is the major for me because I felt instantly drawn to it.
So how in coming coming to that class, I don't know if you stumbled on it or if you sort of sought it out, but coming to that class, did you feel like that was like this disruption of one long experience of education and like a shift to another lane? Or do you feel like there was something about your life inside or outside educational spaces, sort of K through, whatever year in college you come into this class? Do you feel like there were experiences that class sort of linked to and sort of drew together that made sense? And I'm just wondering, like, was part of what was like the transformative moment, the way it sort of drew together something about the things leading up to that moment? I mean, you said Common Core just leaves Black life out of the curriculum. Did you feel like this was connecting to the sort of like something else about that journey through high school, college, up to that moment?
Absolutely. I feel like I was able to find a sense of belonging. At SF State, I learned more about myself, my ancestors. My mom is adopted and my dad doesn't know his dad, and my grandmother on my dad's side passed away when I was a baby, and so there's not much I know about my family. And
Mm.
so coming to San Francisco State, one, it wasn't my top choice. Sorry, Gators, but they were not they were not my top choice. Things happened in the family where I have a sibling that's facing incarceration, and then I have another sibling that's battling cancer. So it just made sense to kind of stay closer to home. And initially, I got into 14 schools. Initially, I wanted to go to like UCLA or go to Spelman College so I can have that like out of state or out of area experience. But I do tell people the best decision I ever made was choosing San Francisco State. I became a young mom as an undergrad. I had two kids. I'm pushing this double seated stroller on campus. I also was raising my nephew who was 5 or 6 at the time. And any other department would have probably said, you know what, it seems like you have a lot going on. Why don't you defer a semester? Come back when you're ready. But those Africana studies professors, they really embodied that proverb that it takes a village. And so when I would miss class, they would email me like, "Hey, if you're missing class because you have morning sickness, we noticed you like the graham crackers. We noticed you like your banana nut bread and your apple juice." They did everything possible to accommodate me, even having students rotate with watching my kids in the hallway so I can focus if I had an oral presentation or focus on taking a test. And that type of commitment to student success, I don't feel like I would have graduated without that. My first introduction to a history course at SF State was my first semester, and that was my first F. I was taking this history class and it was centered on like Reconstruction period. I was like, oh, this might be like fun learning about US history. Wrong. I was the only black person in there and that didn't bother me. What bothered me is when the professor said that slavery was the best thing that happened to black people. And then he pointed at me. It was like, yeah, so what do you think? How has the impact of slavery improved your people? Do you feel more civilized? I felt like he kind of targeted me. That I'm already coming
This
in.
sounds like out of some like horror movie, actually.
Oh yeah, I came in like already waddling, and I'm pregnant with another kid in a stroller. So I'm walking in as a statistic. I'm the only black person, and then when I tried to advocate for myself and give him a real history lesson on what I know to be true about black history, for that he like just would give me bad grades on my assignments, and I got an F. And I went to the Africana Studies department chair. Her name was Dr. Dorothy Saruda. I let her know. And that department, they rallied behind me. They supported me. They tried to help me get the grade withdrawn off my transcript. But because I retook a history class in Africana Studies and it wasn't like from the history department itself, that F is still on my undergraduate transcript. So that was like a very humbling experience. And it was a huge culture shock because I was like, this is a historian. And like, you're supposed to be helping us learn more about each other's histories, not make us feel further oppressed while sitting in this class setting. And in that moment, I felt like college wasn't for me. And I stumbled across the Black Studies department because at SF State, I don't know if you've ever been to our campus, but the Ethnic Studies department is in the same building as psychology. So it's College of Ethnic Studies, but then psychology is also in that building. And I saw flyers and I walked in. I shared with her what was going on. She was like, hey, it's too late for you to enroll into a class this semester, but what about next semester? And then that's how I took my first introduction to Black psychology class that second semester, and I thrived. From there, all of my classes were Africana Studies.
That's amazing. I'm glad I followed up and you get to put all of those moments out there. It's interesting, now that you have a PhD, you're a college professor, you can like actually look at that F a little differently as like a it's almost like a part of a novel or something. But I can imagine at the moment it's and still a symbol of the worst in some ways, but that story about Africana Studies department and, everything from, I heard you. You know, I know you like graham crackers when you have morning sickness. To take this Black psychology class, right? So from like the body as like and it's like purest material, like can't hold food down, to like the deepest learning about the nature of the human person. I mean, I love that Africana Studies played that for you, because that's actually what the field is supposed to do. You know, it's what hopefully what education is supposed to do. But I think Black Studies is a field that has a different kind of commitment to the whole person, and it's come out in a lot of these podcasts. And I really like you giving some witness to that in your own life as a student, and I'm sure also as a teacher, because these lessons stick with you, in each phase of life and career. Which is actually a nice way of sort of transitioning to the second question, which is to just ask you to talk a little bit about the portrait of Black studies you work with, how you imagine and think about the field. And I think about this question in the context of its origins, which is student struggle, right? And student struggle to have Black life represented in the curriculum. Right. All those things you're talking about, what does it mean for Reconstruction to be taught in this way, right? Where Black life isn't even represented in any kind of sufficient way, in the way that travels across all disciplines. But Black studies was going to be that place where you could study Black life, Black intellectual traditions, Black psychology, Black sociology. And then that also was happening, that commitment to Black studies as an intellectual endeavor came alongside that radicalization of Black liberation struggle that had abolished so many of those boundaries between classroom and community, between study and activism, between books and like political prescriptions. And so I think in some ways that how we imagine Black studies always has that little tension in it, right? A commitment to intellectual life, but also a commitment to a certain kind of politics. And so I'm interested to hear you talk about how you sort of in that framing or in that context, what's your portrait of Black studies? How do you imagine the field, and, how does it function in your scholarly and teacherly imagination?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I imagine the field of Black Studies as like a living, evolving discipline that is rooted in the struggles, rooted in activism, student activism, and as an intellectual labor of Black communities. In the United States, Black Studies, it emerged from the intersections of student activism, professor advocacy, and community organizing during the late 1960s. But most notable, with the longest student strike in the history of higher education in 1968 at SF State. And that strike is not only what catalyzed the creation of the first College of Ethnic Studies in the US, but also established Black Studies as the first department, spearheaded by the late Dr. Nathan Hare, who just passed away last year. And so, as a space for both scholarly rigor and political engagement, its origin story reminds us that Black Studies has always been both a site of resistance and a platform for intellectual production, a transition or a tradition that asserts the importance of Black perspectives in shaping our knowledge, shaping our policy, and further shaping our culture. And I believe at San Francisco State University, my teaching practice, it embodies this blueprint. I structure courses in ways that merge rigorous academic inquiry with socially relevant inquiry, because that's super important, not just for Black students, but for all diverse students that I come into contact with. And students engage with primary sources in my class, community narratives, contemporary scholarship, but while also critically examining the socio-political realities that impact Black lives. And while we like to, give credit to SF State for having the first and only College of Ethnic Studies, I want to also give credit to Merritt College, because
Oh
if it
yeah.
wasn't for the founders of the Black Panther Party, Dr. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, back in 1966, 2 years before our strike, they were already teaching Black Studies. We came 2 years after the fact. And so I like to always acknowledge them first as being trailblazers, getting the ball rolling. No, they didn't have a College of Ethnic Studies, but they were already teaching Black history there. So I want to highlight them. And this approach, it models how Black Studies bridges the development of our intellectual tradition with tangible political, which I love the Black Panthers, by the way, and cultural impact. And in my classroom in particularly, students are encouraged not only to analyze history, but also to consider how knowledge can inform activism, how it can inform policy and transformative practices today. I don't like for my students to get stuck in the strike of 1968 because we still have battles we're fighting in 2025. If we think about the Black Panther Party, their 10-point program, we still haven't fully realized what they were fighting for. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. If we go back and look at the archival history of San Francisco State student strike, a lot of their demands that they have for the college administration still has yet to be realized. So I say all of that to say ultimately Black studies is both a discipline and a movement that has to be continued beyond that strike. And it's a site where scholarship, culture, and activism intersect, where the past informs the present. So students, faculty, staff, alum, we can have that Sankofa moment when we're on campus or, even when we're doing our assignments or when we're having these scholarly talks like now.
I mean, it's so interesting about thinking about, in my experience, having taught in Black studies for 20-something years at this point, it used to be, for me, it used to take a little bit of work for students to see how a student strike and student radicalism was something more than a kind of cool memory. Because, the thing about the Black Panthers, I love Black Panther thinking. I think Huey Newton, especially intercommunalism, I think this sort of stuff is so intellectually fascinating, but also socially transformative. But, students first fall in love with the icon, right? I mean, he's handsome, the jackets, the guns, everybody's fashion sense and photogenic sort of thing. And they fall in love with that. And then it's like, I used to have to struggle so hard to get to, not struggle so hard, but push pretty hard to get them to see, like, this is not just a view of the past, right? These are things we have to keep in mind. I have to say, in the last 2 years, since the struggle for free Palestine has come to campuses, and now with our far-right government, it's interesting talking with students this way, and they're like, we should be like that. I mean, you say a Sankofa moment, it's almost like they don't really have to look backwards. They're just sort of looking in front of them and saying, you're describing our reality or our potential reality. Because what we do is under siege for all those reasons you laid out, that it's, if we're linking education to social transformation, ideas to activism and social change, that's something that might call for some radical student action, professor action too, but I have less faith in professors, if I could be honest. I think we struggle with that, yeah. But so, and I want to follow up on that to ask you about your own education and how you think it's impacted sort of back and forth with Africana Studies and education, which is where your graduate work was done. And how do you see that relationship? Because education has its own sort of priorities and methods, and Africana Black Studies really has a different kind of expansiveness to it. It's multidisciplinary, drawing from everything from art to social science to music to literature. So, your graduate work, your undergraduate being so rooted in Black studies, your graduate work in education, and now back to Africana Studies. I'm interested in how that played between the education as a disciplinary orientation and Africana Studies as a multidisciplinary, expansive, sort of open horizon. How those things connect for you, and how that impacts both your research and your teaching.
Yeah, so my graduate work in education, I got my master's in equity and social justice, and then culminating into furthering my education with a doctorate in educational leadership. That provided a foundation in pedagogy that was equity focused, research, and institutional analysis. And this disciplinary grounding has been critical in shaping my approach to my teaching, my approach to research, and particularly my focus on social justice and culturally responsive practices. And transitioning into the Department of Africana Studies and ethnic studies at the other two institutions I teach at, it represents both like a natural progression and a deliberate expansion of my intellectual and professional horizons. Earlier in my career, I graduated from SF State in 2015 with my BA, and I was like, I'm going to go out and change the world. Wrong. I didn't change the world right away. I ended up working at the YMCA making $10 to $11 an hour as an instructional aide, as a working in Head Start. And then I went back to school and got my post baccalaureate degree in ethnic studies, and that opened the door for me to teach in the K-12 setting. And then I realized, okay, you know what? It's not the students. I want to train the teachers, because I feel like the teaching profession, it kind of like sustains this intergenerational legacy of oppression, and like that translate in the interactions where, like, there's a lack of student teacher positive relationships. And so I went back to school and got my degree in equity and social justice, and from there I decided, okay, I'm going to leave K-12 and go into higher education. So transitioning into the departments of Africana Studies and in ethnic studies, it really really changed my life. These interdisciplinary spaces allow me to merge educational theory with critical frameworks. And it also allows me to create a holistic approach to teaching that engages both systemic analysis and lived experiences. When you're teaching in K-12, it's very controlled. You're limited to what you can do. And when you go out of the landscape of what's accepted as like part of the teaching standard, which is controlled by Common Core and then like approved by the WASP committee that comes in, sometimes you can get in trouble. And so working in interdisciplinary departments has been transformative for my research and teaching. It has encouraged me to approach questions about race, questions about gender, sexuality, community from perspectives that are historical, social, political, cultural, rather than through a single disciplinary lenses. And so to give an example, in my graduate level courses that I teach in the Masters of Social Work, I integrate insights from Africana Studies, from critical race theory and educational leadership to challenge my students to consider how structural inequities intersect with our everyday lives. And this cross pollination, it strengthens both my research but also my pedagogy, and it pushes me to think more creatively about methodology, more creatively about curriculum design, and the ways knowledge is produced and disseminated. And so the interdisciplinary context has always shaped my understanding of the university as a site of both learning and activism. And I always try to draw back on that 68 strike and the establishment of ethnic studies, because I model in my classroom how activism, how scholarship, and how community engagement intersects. And even like in my management position, I most recently stepped down to commit to fully teaching, but I was a senior director of culture and social justice at San Francisco State, and I was running 5 departments. And I realized that you have to speak to the people before you speak for the people. And the impact that I was trying to make in a management position, it wasn't really translating, because they already had the formula for how they wanted things to work. And that's when I was like, you know what? If I love teaching, I should stop trying to do what everybody says is good for me, whether it's a promotion or not, and do what feels good for the soul. And Africana Studies feels good for the soul. I love commemorating the student strike. I love the fact that I was able to meet Dr. Nathan Hare and meet, Dr. Jimmy Garrett, because he is the creator of the first Black student union in the nation at SF State. He left his HBCU. He was a freedom rider, and he left his HBCU to come to SF State to stir up some good trouble. And if it wasn't for the creation of BSU starting as the Black Campus Movement, which later became the Third World Liberation Front strike, then we wouldn't even be having these type of conversations. And I didn't even know, honestly, I learned last year, there were so many Black Panthers that attended SF State. Judy Juanita, she was the news writer. She wrote the newsletters for the Black Panther Party. She attended SF State, and she teaches at UC Berkeley. And she talked about how her and her husband were under high surveillance of the FBI. A lot of the students were expelled from college for being engaged in a student protest. And so when we talk about the strike, I always tell the students, like, if you're going to go out and protest, make sure you know what you're standing up for. Know what you're getting yourself into. Go back and watch those videos and Furthermore, talk to those student strikers that come back once a year to commemorate their activism, because if they didn't go into education, what would they be doing? If it wasn't for their sacrifice, what would we be talking about?
Yeah. Look, I'm sure you have plenty of stuff to do and plenty of stuff to write and think about, but that would be a great book for somebody to write, for you to write on Black Panthers at San Francisco State. I mean, I just think those stories, I mean, when you said, like, you know, you just recently learned this, I think most people would be learning that, but it's so important and so interesting and so connected to, you know, as you said about Merritt College, right? It's like, on the one hand, you can say San Francisco State has this strike, has this event, creation of a Black Studies department, Ethnic Studies department, but this longer history and all of these, like, I don't know what you want to call them, like side roads or buttresses or things that really like made all of that possible, like finding ways to make sure those stories get preserved is incredibly important. I'm going to pester you over email if you have any contact information for any of these folks to get them on this podcast for real, because this is absolutely essential. So let me just add that book to your list of things to do in your life. But I would buy that book and teach that book for sure. So
I actually did write a book, but it's not about that.
yeah, it would be a great one. And you know, sort of to follow up on that, I'm interested in how you think. You know, it's really interesting for you to talk about sort of the way education comes back into and then is changed by Africana Studies. Is really nicely told. I really love that. And I also love the motif of like wanting to teach the teachers, you know, that if educational systems are a source of problems, they're also a source of solutions if they're transformed. And that's a way of making that direct intervention. So I love that. That's a great contribution to our thinking on the podcast. And I wanted to ask you then how you think your own orientation through education, coming back to Black Studies, how you think that fits in the history of Black Studies, into the tradition of Black Studies. Sort of what does that join as part of the tradition of the field? But also, what do you think that the kinds of research you're doing and the kinds of things you're thinking about, how do you think it pushes new boundaries and opens up new horizons for the field?
Yeah, I think that, that's a really good question. No one's ever asked me that. I've never been stuck when being asked the question. I think my orientation to it was supposed to give me an introduction to everything I didn't know prior. But I think once we graduate, we shouldn't be living in this like Back to the Future, time zone where we're always just stuck in 1968. So I think when you graduate out of Africana Studies, they want you to continue the work. They want you to contribute to the field and not just regurgitate what you've learned from it. And so my contribution to the field has been introducing Tupac Shakur's Thug Life philosophy as a framework for decoding the Black male experience. Decoding it as them being stripped of their humanity when they're trying to, successfully evade the school to prison pipeline, because that's what my research is on. Them having to be so strong, having to maintain resilience in order to just exist. I think that's my contribution to the field, developing Black urban storytelling, seeing that there's a gap. I mean, critical race theory wasn't born out of Africana Studies. It emerged out of critical legal studies, but we still pull in that storytelling or that interest convergence pillars to teach these Africana Studies classes. And I drew on that to fill in the gaps, because there's not a framework or an epistemology that talks about the Black experience. There's some that talk about the African experience, but the Black experience in terms of what happens when the system grabs us. I mean, if we think about slavery, if we think about Michelle Alexander, what she said is still prevalent today. She said, we live in a racial caste system and slavery has just taken a new form. And so I think that's what Africana Studies helped expose in me. If you would have told me 10 years, 15 years ago, you're going to be a researcher, I'd have like, you're lying. I'm just trying to graduate from college. These get
Yeah.
degrees. If you would have told me I was going to go on and get my doctorate, I probably wouldn't have believed it. But every step of the way, Africana Studies has been there. All of my mentors, all of my references for jobs actually are Africana Studies professors. They helped me get my first jobs, whether it was at the Head Start, whether it was at the school district, and even in Africana Studies itself. They've been molding me and telling me like, hey, we think you'll be a great fit for this. Even when I don't feel like I believe in myself, they're like, no, you got it. And we want to push you to do this. Right now, I'm working with my department chair, Dr. Abul Petrie, on creating a new program for Africana Studies that's rooted in student affairs. I think that's super important. The country doesn't have that. And so when our students graduate, like myself, I graduated and I was like, I'm going to go change the world. And I was like, wait, why am I at the YMCA? I have this BA in Africana Studies. But I think something that has also oriented me and also what I can expose my students to, what I feel like the field didn't teach me, is how to market myself. Showing that if you have a degree in Africana Studies, your skill set is applicable to any field that you want to immerse yourself into. It's all about how you market yourself. On paper, it's all about how you network, whether it's on social media via LinkedIn or network at these career fairs or, in these spaces. I didn't know how to do that. When I graduated, I didn't even have a resume. I didn't have a cover letter. I had no work experience, so I bumped my head a lot. And because I bumped my head a lot, I feel like that's what made me the scholar, practitioner, and researcher that I am today, bumping my head, learning through trial and error, where my students can see themselves in me. And I tell them like, hey, I didn't have a cookie cutter experience in higher education. Not as an undergrad, definitely not as a graduate. And so if I can do it, you can too. Here's my story. And I think students respect honesty. I always tell
Yeah.
them, I wasn't always on dean's list, okay? I didn't get there. I had to bump my head a lot because being first generation, there's a lot on your shoulders. Everybody's bragging on you like she's getting all A's. They don't even know I'm on a hot chip and Red Bull diet. I'm crash studying because I've been overloaded myself with 12 to 18 units, and I'm struggling just to prove that I can belong in here. And many of us, we experience that imposter syndrome. And so without Africana Studies, I don't know if I would have truly found a sense of belonging at San Francisco State. Africana Studies, they provide every department I've ever been to of Africana Studies, whether it's at a CSU, UC, or a private, they all have this very nurturing environment where it just feels like home, a home away from home. Even if you're not Black, you can still feel like you're a cousin or an auntie, or a bonus uncle in the community. And that's what I hope to give back to my students, because that's what they gave to me. But I think anybody that has a degree in Africana Studies, yes, date back to its origins, but also contribute to the field. What is missing? What still needs to be done? There's so many things that hasn't been explored. And a lot of students, I'm really worried about the current climate, because if college becomes increasingly more expensive, then that knowledge becomes lost or
Yeah.
becomes forgotten. Or if they're attacking the very institutions that teaches, things like Africana Studies, ethnic studies, or teaches critical race theory, if they completely got rid of that, then where do we go from there? And so that's why I always tell students, you have a radical responsibility as a student. And I asked them the first week of class, why are you taking this class? Is it to fulfill a GE? Is it so you can fit in with your friends? Who are you trying to connect with? Why are you taking the class? Because that's going to determine your experience. Not my teaching, but that's going to determine your experience, your why for why you're here.
I love that. I wish we had had this conversation a couple weeks ago. I'm teaching an introductory level class with almost all first semester students, getting them to think really hard about the why. I guess it's not too late. It's only the third week, but I think but that is so important, that sense of why are you here? To also get them to think critically about that. Maybe you're not here for the right reasons, but now that you're here and it's past ad drop, you have to stay in. Think about how this could be meaningful to you. And I really love this connection between student affairs and Africana Studies. I'm going to bring that to my department. I mean, we struggle a lot with those very questions. Students ask us individually, what can I do with an Africana Studies degree? And we all have our individual conversations. And then people are like, maybe we should make a video. And, with some sort of common questions or an FAQ on the website. I think all those things are important, but I really like that as building it into the curriculum itself, because it's easy for academics to say. I've never said this, but I think a lot of my colleagues will say, like, I shouldn't have to. Students shouldn't be thinking about jobs. They should be thinking about doing well in school, following your passions or something like that. And I don't disagree with that, but the idea that like getting a job is something that they shouldn't be concerned about, it's like a fairly decadent thing to say. I'm like, I can't be the only one who was in college with nowhere to go. So the job actually matters to everybody. And finding ways to answer that beyond just our individual conversations, I think I really love that you're taking on that initiative. I hope it's successful. We'll stay in touch because I want to know where that goes.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's going. I love my students. Like, in fact, before I became visiting assistant professor, I was just a lecturer begging for classes, trying to show my worth. And like the student evaluations, like that matters more to me than like what my colleagues say about me. The fact that they will email the department chair, they'll email the deans, like, we want her to teach more classes. And being able to have that impact on students. One student said, you know what? No teacher has ever asked me the why. And so when I do the why, I have them do a privilege walk. And I can send it to you. It's very specific to Africana studies, the questions I ask.
I'd love
And
that.
I also tell the students, like, hey, even if you're non-Black, I still want you to participate because I'm going to give you an index card. I want you to write your life goal on this index card. I'm going to ask you a series of 12 statements. If it's attainable or if it's applicable to you, you're going to step on that line. If it's not, you stay where you are. After, I want you to look back at that index card and tell me, is your life goal attainable? Why or why not? Is it because of the barriers that we identified in the 12 statements? Is it because your race? Is it because your socioeconomic status? And that really helps them unpack their privilege, unpacks their biases. And then everybody's looking around like, wow, we have more in common than we thought. And I like having those moments in the classroom. So I let them know we're all here for the same reason. We might not look alike, but we're all here with the same end goal. So let's make sure that we each one teach one. Speak to the people before we speak for the people so we all get to where we need to go. And that's something that I always see in the evaluations. Like, no teacher has ever asked me the why. Had me write down my life goal and had me like see if it's attainable for me. And sometimes it gets emotional. Sometimes students cry and,
I was going
they
to say
trauma
that's an
dump.
intensely emotional thing to even engage with students, and I mean that in the best way. Yeah.
Yeah. And then at the end, we do a toast for change. What do you want to change? Is it something in your life? Something in your academic life? Something in your future career? Something in your family? What do you want to change? And then we have that toast for change. And at the end of the semester, we release whatever it is that they feel like they wanted to change or whatever they overcome. We put it in a balloon and we release it to the sky at the end. And I told them everything you thought you couldn't do, you did it. So I try to celebrate and empower them in that way so they know beyond this class, I am a resource. And they usually come back and hang out with me at office hours or like they'll be like, can I come in and let your students know that they're in for a treat for your class? And so that
I
makes me
love that's
happy.
great. Yeah, it should make you happy. That's the dream come true right there. So, um, well, let me ask you this first of last two questions. Yeah, and for those of us who care about classrooms, thank you for all of that. That's all that stuff is super interesting and important. I mean, we educate whole people. We don't educate just a small chunk of a brain, right? It's the whole person in there, and treating it like that is amazing. I love it. But as a sort of second to last question for you, I'm interested thinking about the history of Black studies. What do you think that the field has done well, but also what do you think it has not done particularly well?
I think what the field has done well is given us an intellectual home to archive our research, archive our ideas, archive the blueprints for what has been successful within the field. I think where we're failing as a field is we're not adapting with the new generation. We're not as innovative as we should be. And so I'm noticing the trend across like the United States where there's a decline of people like, majoring in Africana studies. And so I'm like, is it the marketing? Is it the courses we're offering? Like, what is it for why we are declining with being able to get students to commit to us as a major and or as a minor? So I feel like we need to become more innovative, to be able to catch up to today's times. Actually, giving surveys to the current students before they leave. There should be some type of exit survey, and that should inform the type of research that faculty should be doing, using the data to inform, like, oh, okay, students really didn't like this, or they wanted more of this, or they had a higher expectation of this. And then also talking to those alum, where are they now? I think that's something the field needs to do better too, so we can see, like, oh, with an Africana studies degree, you can go work in corporate. Oh, you can work for, like, the music industry, or you can work for, like, the NBA or the NFL. Just being able to see that, I think that that's super important because a lot of folks don't want to go into academia. And so it goes
Mhm.
back to that thing that I said, we need to know how to market ourselves so we can know how to transfer that information to our students so they know how to go out and say, actually, I do qualify for this job. Did you know when I took these 3 Africana studies classes, it taught me how to budget, it taught me how to critically think, it taught me how to do strategic planning. Anything that any other major can do, I can do too. I think that's something that the field is lacking. And if we can do that and like do that and also I think it'd be important to do some cross collaborations. Like, I love what you all are doing with the podcast, and this should be like a regular conversation where Africana study departments across the country are meeting and learning from each other. That's how we grow as a field. And I feel like we're just not doing that enough. We're working in silos. Yes, we work at different institutions, but we should be growing the field so they don't try to erase what's been done and what's still needed to be done.
Yeah, and on the learning from each other part, I mean, Ashley, my collaborator, I mean, I also collaborate with Bree and Olivia, but Ashley and I starting the podcast, and where I think you'll be like episode 192 or something. Ashley and I talk about how much we almost feel like it's unfair because by taking on this project, we've like we've just been able to learn so much by hearing all, talking with all of you. It's not just listening, but it's conversation with you all. And it's like, how can this become something that's not just the 2 and now 4 of us taking on as a project and other people listening in, which I think is great. But also, as you say, like departments turning to each other and saying, in some ways, one of the things I want my department to do is just have a regular conversation where we just sit and say, what is Black studies to us? I mean, it's like my kind of trope about the field. I'm like the first and most important question of Black studies is, what is Black studies?
Hmm.
And I don't mean that in like, we don't know what we're doing. I mean, that is like, people have such interesting things to say about it. And if you want evidence of that, listen to this podcast, listen to this conversation with you. I mean, it's like what Black studies, the way you've articulated the meaning of Black studies has traveled across so many dimensions of our time with other human beings, time with ourselves, time with politics. And people tell such different stories, and that ought to be really invigorating. But something about, I mean, it's a professional life, and there's something about, I think people want to sort of put their work aside when they go home or sort of minimize their workload. But the power of conversation and, what it can mean for students. I really loved what you said about, marketing ourselves, not just as ourselves. I think that's such a professor default mode of, well, I can market Black studies if you want to be a Black studies professor.
Hmm.
But it's, can you market Black studies if somebody wants to go, work at a museum or, work at a nonprofit or work in banking? That's real mentorship and that's real imagination. I like you sort of calling us into that space to plan and converse. So thank you for that.
My ultimate dream is for my Africana Studies department for us to create like a master's program or create like some type of PhD program, but I want to do it in collaboration with another institution where students have the option. They can earn their degree from us or from our partnering schools. So like let's say if your department and my department collaborated, students could like take a semester to visit SF State for a semester, or we can send our students there. I think that that type of cross collaboration and students being exposed to different pioneers in the field, that also can help us grow the Africana Studies field, like, in an even bigger way. That's like futuristic thinking. I don't know what it would take to get the ball rolling, but I would love to see more partnerships with that.
Keep us in mind because I think San Francisco and DC, I mean, University of Maryland is just right outside of DC. Those are two places people would want to live. But I love this idea of collaborating across departments and even across cities. It's come from your very first comment about what you learned from Africana Studies, really embodying the "it takes a village" thing. Well, maybe it takes a village to do a really good master's program.
Yeah.
So maybe the most boring formulation of that, but possibly transformative for some people. So last question, and maybe in some ways you've already spoken to this, but I'll ask it as a way of wrapping up. What in the Black Studies context, what is the question you would want us to all be asking, or what is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
How can Africana Studies be taken more seriously? Not just as a field of study or a major, but as a way of life. Because we're talking about people's lived experiences. So, how can people's lived experiences be viewed as social capital in our society? So we can grow it. Because I think another pressing disparity with our field is lack of funding. Like, it's hard to sustain funding, especially when we have a decline of enrollment, when we have budget cuts and we can't keep our tenure track faculty, and we're stretched thin with our part-time lecturer faculty. And so how do we sustain? What do we want our legacy to be beyond the start of the field? I think those are the questions that we should be asking, because if we don't, we're going to lose everything that the people before us worked so hard for.
That's a wonderful place to wrap up. I love that as a question for us to all be asking and for us to all be thinking about. Could not agree with you more. And yeah, our future is always really precarious, and so we need to know. We need to know all those things that you're asking us right there, but also across this podcast. And also, I like that you linked it to, what about all those people who struggled so hard so that we could do this work? Like, we maybe owe them something, and we owe them that thoughtfulness, if nothing else. So, yeah. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Shanice. I really appreciate you taking the time and all of your ways of thinking and discussing and reflecting on your own experience with Africana Studies. This is a wonderful contribution to the series. So thank you so much for that.